considered above and below rapids. The second area to consider is long, flat, windswept bays, where the wave action riles up the water, which cuts down on light penetration. Combine these conditions with the shiner spawn, and you have the next major event affecting the entire food chain. The shiners will spawn in rapids large and small, and in the flat, shallow bays. This triggers one of the most aggressive feeding frenzies of the years, which occurs when huge schools of shiners get swept into shallow, muddy waters of bays exposed to strong winds. Walleyes and small pike feed aggressively on the disoriented minnows, and big pike have a heyday feeding on the smaller active fish that are concentrated on their feeding. On this day, all of the pieces came together to create the perfect situation. It was our first day on an almost virgin lake. Remember the first rule of fishing, go where the fish are. We looked at the map to identify good areas, but an east wind meant we would have to go to the far end of the lake to find a windswept bay, and the east wind told us that a cold front was on its way in. We knew the fishing would be awesome. Along the way, we tried several similar bays. They had the right type of structure with weeds, old reeds, and a mud bottom, but the wind didn't have a direct influence on them, and so the shiners were not concentrated. And although there were big pike in those bays, they were scattered. So we took the long boat ride to the far end of the lake. There were several bays with direct wind exposure. By looking at the map, we could identify two rivers coming into the lake. One or both would be a spawning river for walleye. Any of the nearby bays would be spawning bays for northers. As it turned out, our first choice was not ideal. There were no reeds, mostly rock, deep water. So we wasted a little time there, and we went to the second choice, which was one of the smaller of the two rivers. It was perfect. Lots of reeds, a shallow river, and shallow, 4 to 6 feet, along the exposed shore of the bay adjacent to the river. There was no doubt remaining when our first cast produced a 20-pound plus fish. We caught 25 pike between 15 and 24 pounds, 3 over 20 pounds in 4 casts. Each time we cast, as our spoon came through the water, streams of shiners flew out of the water. We even caught several dozen walleye on our Johnson spoons. I know there had to be plenty of smaller pike in this area as well, but we didn't catch very many because the big guys were so aggressive. Another thing to remember, when the fish are very active, use a quick retrieve. Move your bait quick. But if they're fishing slow, if the fish aren't hitting very quickly, then use a slow retrieve. This is another example of knowing what to look for that paid off. Even with this area being loaded with fish, we still concentrated on the premier spots, with 75% of our biggest fish coming out of just 2 spots. The first one was the big point of reeds closest to the river mouth, and the second was a smaller point of reeds extending out from the middle of the bay. Had we not concentrated on the premier points, we may have caught only 25% of those big fish.